In this analysis, the direct connection between the Rockefellers and the creation of the United Nations organization will be made. First, it should be noted that the organization that preceded the United Nations, the League of Nations, received a significant amount of support from Rockefeller-related organizations. In 1927, John D. Rockefeller Jr. provided the League of Nations with $2 million to enhance its international relations library and promote peace through knowledge and understanding. This library of the League of Nations later became known as the United Nations Office at Geneva when the League transferred its assets to the United Nations. According to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, in a statement praising the Rockefeller family's past and present support of international organizations, the interest from that original $2 million loan still provides approximately $150,000 every biennium to the United Nations. The Rockefeller Foundation was also heavily involved with the transition from the League of Nations to the United Nations, as documented in the article The Rockefeller Foundation and the Transition from the League of Nations to the UN by Ludovic Tornes of the University of Geneva. Further connections could be drawn between the Rockefellers and the League of Nations, but for the sake of brevity, we will move on to the United Nations. It is no secret that the land that the United Nations is built upon today was purchased with money donated by the Rockefellers. The official Rockefeller Archive Center has this to say on the matter, quote, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s deep interest in international relations was reflected by his many contributions directed to international causes. Perhaps most outstanding in this field was his gift of $8,515,000 in December 1946 for the purchase of the land for the permanent home of the United Nations in New York. End quote. This land where the United Nations headquarters now sits in New York was originally owned by a prominent real estate developer named William Bill Zeckendorf. As the story goes, Nelson Rockefeller, on behalf of the United Nations, went to Zeckendorf with an offer to buy the property. Zeckendorf agreed, and Nelson's father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., donated the money to the United Nations in order to finance the purchase of the land. While this story is usually presented as just another selfless act of charity by the Rockefellers, there is some evidence to suggest that there were ulterior benefits associated with this donation. See, because the United Nations was set to transform the area, which was mostly old buildings and abandoned slaughterhouses, if someone were to own property in the area, they would see a massive increase in value. As luck would have it, David Rockefeller was one of those ownership interests that would benefit financially. In his own autobiography titled Memoirs, David Rockefeller describes how after becoming a board member of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the endowment bought the land across from where the UN building would be erected and how they profited greatly. Quote, I turned to Bill Zeckendorf and he offered us one of the building sites he had acquired on the west side of First Avenue, across from where the new UN building would be erected. Although the area was still filled with abandoned slaughterhouses and decaying commercial buildings, Bill felt the UN and other related projects would permanently transform the area. He recommended that we buy the parcel before land values skyrocketed and then put up our own building. Several of the more conservative board members thought that the plan was far too risky and criticized spending the endowment's limited funds on a construction project in an unproven location. The endowment's longtime treasurer opposed the project and resigned from the board, predicting it would bankrupt us. However, a strong majority of the board backed the proposal, especially after I was able to persuade Winthrop Aldrich to open a Chase branch on the ground floor. Once the building was completed, we rented much of the building to not-for-profits and easily handled the mortgage payments. As Bill Zeckendorf predicted, the area around the UN quickly became one of New York's prime neighborhoods and continues to be so to this day. End quote. David Rockefeller conveniently leaves out of this passage that it was the same Bill Zeckendorf who sold the land to the United Nations, through the funding of David's father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., that was selling the endowment the land near the United Nations off of his prediction that the land values would skyrocket. I'm not sure of the extent that insider information was involved in this deal, but in the least, this proves that a Rockefeller did seemingly benefit financially from the creation of the United Nations in that location. As a side note, Wikipedia also twice refers to the Rockefellers owning land in another area around the United Nations known as Tudor City. The sources for that information in those two entries seem to be of questionable origin, so I cannot yet present that information as fact. Another family connection to the founding of the United Nations is David's brother Nelson Rockefeller, being a member of the U.S. delegation at the gathering that marked the founding of the United Nations, the 1945 Conference on International Organization. Nelson would also go on to fund the United Nations World Magazine in an effort to promote the UN. It should be noted, the designers of the United Nations headquarters were working out of an office in Rockefeller Center. The chief architect of this project was Wallace K. Harrison, a man with interesting Rockefeller connections himself. Charlene Myers, author of the book Capital of the World, The Race to Host the United Nations, describes Harrison as, quote, one of the designers of Rockefeller Center, a Rockefeller relation by marriage, a confidant of Nelson Rockefeller, and a member of the booster committee that had been working to bring the UN to New York. End quote. This Rockefeller support of the United Nations continued after the creation of the UN and continues to this day. It would be too much to list all of the ways that Rockefeller-related organizations contribute to the United Nations today, but their influence can be seen through examples like the Rockefeller Foundation providing grants to the United Nations, or the Rockefeller Brothers Fund funding the United Nations Foundation. More important, though, than the motive to make some money off of a land deal was the Rockefeller vision of a one-world government, as revealed on page 405 of David Rockefeller's autobiography, Memoirs. It is in this passage that David reveals his family's ultimate goal. Quote, for more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents such as my encounter with Castro to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. End quote. The United Nations fits well into the Rockefeller family goal to build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world. Through United Nations programs such as Agenda 21, local decision-making power is being eroded and being replaced by regional governments that continue to become more centralized. In the analysis titled The Problems with Connecticut Climate Change Policy, Part 4, The Rockefeller Connection, the connections between Agenda 21, the Rockefellers, and current events taking place in Connecticut are detailed. Through these connections, a pattern emerges of a system being created that is designed to reduce the decision-making power of individual towns, cities, and states, transferring that power over to large, centralized, non-elected bureaucracies. For more information on this, follow the related links.